Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
Most Christians grow up believing the Bible is a book of love, mercy, wisdom, and moral clarity. They are taught verses about kindness, forgiveness, and compassion. But very few are encouraged to read the entire book carefully. Even fewer are asked to sit with the verses that make them uncomfortable, the ones that clash with modern values, basic human decency, or simple logic. These verses are usually skipped in sermons, ignored in Sunday school, or explained away with excuses that never quite hold up. This video is not about mocking believers. It is about honesty. If a book is truly divine, then every verse matters. You cannot cherry-pick only the pleasant parts and pretend the rest does not exist. So let us talk about some verses Christians rarely bring up, not because atheists hide them, but because believers prefer not to look at them too closely. Take the issue of slavery. Many Christians say slavery was wrong and that the Bible opposes it. But when you actually read the Bible, you find something very different. In Exodus chapter 21, God gives detailed instructions on how to own slaves, not how to free them, how to buy them, how long to keep them, and how badly you can beat them. It literally says that if a master beats a slave and the slave does not die within a day or two, the master is not punished. Why? Because the slave is his property. This is not a metaphor. This is not symbolic language. It is law, divine law according to Christian belief. Now ask yourself a simple question. If God is all-knowing and all-good, why would he ever need to regulate slavery instead of condemning it outright? Humans eventually realized slavery was immoral without divine help. Why did God lag behind human morality? Christians often respond by saying slavery back then was different, more humane. But owning another human being as property is not humane under any definition. And even if it were different, an all-powerful God could have said, "Do not own people." He managed to say, "Do not eat shrimp." Surely he could say, "Do not enslave humans." Now consider women. The Bible repeatedly treats women as lesser beings. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, women are told to remain silent and not teach men. The reason given is not culture. It is creation. It says Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Eve was deceived. This is used to justify male authority over women. Think about what that means. Half of humanity is told to be quiet and submissive because of a story about a talking snake and a rib. Modern Christians like to say men and women are equal, but their own scripture does not support that. Equality had to be borrowed from secular human values, not derived from the Bible. Then there is rape. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, if a man rapes a virgin who is not engaged, he must pay her father and marry her. The woman has no choice. She is forced to live with her rapist for life. This is presented as justice. Now imagine this happening today. A woman is assaulted, and the solution is to force her to marry the attacker. No modern Christian would defend this law in real life. Yet this law comes straight from the same God they call loving and just. If morality comes from God, why do believers reject his moral instructions when they become inconvenient? And it gets worse. In the same chapter, if a woman is raped in a city and does not scream loud enough, she can be stoned to death, because it is assumed she consented. This is not about protection. This is about controlling women and protecting male honor. Christians often say the Old Testament does not count anymore. But Jesus himself said he did not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it. He said not one jot or tittle would pass away. So you cannot simply erase these verses without contradicting Jesus. Let us talk about violence. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, God commands Saul to kill the Amalekites. Not just the men, women, children, infants, and even animals. Every living thing. Saul spares some people and animals, and God is angry with him for not killing enough. Read that again slowly. God is upset because too many children survived. This is not self-defense. This is not war necessity. This is genocide, and it is commanded by God himself. Christians will say God had reasons. The Amalekites were evil, but infants are not evil. Animals are not evil. Collective punishment is something we consider immoral when humans do it. But when God does it, believers call it justice. Now think about hell. Jesus talks about hell more than anyone else in the Bible. Eternal fire, endless punishment, no second chances, infinite suffering for finite crimes. Even human justice systems recognize that punishment should fit the crime. But Christianity proposes eternal torture for disbelief, doubt, or being born into the wrong religion. If a human father locked his child in a basement and set it on fire forever, we would call him a monster. But when God does it, Christians call it love mixed with justice. At some point, words lose their meaning. And it is not just hell. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus says that anyone who does not hate their father, mother, wife, children, and even their own life cannot be his disciple. Christians rush to say hate means love less, but that is not what the word means, and even if it did, demanding loyalty above family is a classic cult tactic. Healthy relationships do not require you to put an invisible being above your own children. Yet this is presented as moral virtue. Then there is prayer. Jesus says, "Ask and you shall receive. Knock and the door will be opened." But reality tells a different story. Millions of people pray for healing, safety, and survival. Children die of cancer. Natural disasters kill thousands. Nothing changes. Christians then say God answers prayers in mysterious ways, or sometimes the answer is no. But that makes prayer indistinguishable from chance. If every outcome can be explained as God's will, then prayer becomes meaningless. You are talking to yourself and calling it faith. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus says he did not come to bring peace but a sword. He says families will be divided because of him, and they are. Religion has broken families, ended friendships, and fueled conflicts for centuries. This is not accidental. It is built into the message. And finally, consider salvation itself. According to Christianity, belief matters more than behavior. A serial killer who accepts Jesus at the last moment goes to heaven. A kind, honest, compassionate atheist goes to hell. This is not justice. This is belief-based favoritism. Morality without empathy becomes cruelty, and faith without questioning becomes obedience. These verses are not rare. They are not obscure. They are part of the core text. Ignoring them does not make them disappear. It only reveals how selective belief really is. If this book were written today with these verses intact, it would be rejected instantly. The only reason it gets a pass is because of tradition and fear, and that should make anyone uncomfortable. Another verse Christians rarely sit with is found in Mark chapter 16, where Jesus says believers will be able to handle snakes and drink poison without harm. This passage has caused real harm in the modern world. There are documented cases in the United States where pastors encouraged snake handling as proof of faith, and people died. When this happens, Christians suddenly say the verse is symbolic or not meant for today. But the text does not say that. It says these signs will follow those who believe. If faith requires excuses to survive reality, that faith is already cracked. Then there is the idea of inherited guilt. Christianity teaches that all humans are born sinful because of Adam and Eve. A mistake made by two people thousands of years ago somehow stains every newborn child. This is morally absurd. No modern justice system punishes children for the crimes of their ancestors. We reject that idea instinctively because it is unfair. Yet Christianity makes inherited guilt the foundation of its salvation story. First, you are declared broken without consent. Then you are offered a cure you did not ask for. Romans chapter 9 makes this even worse. It says God creates some people for destruction and others for mercy. It says God hardens hearts so he can punish them. Pharaoh's heart is hardened by God himself, then Pharaoh is punished for it. This removes free will entirely. If God controls who believes and who does not, then punishment becomes meaningless. You cannot blame someone for a decision they were divinely programmed to make. Christians often respond by saying God's ways are higher than ours. But that is not an explanation. It is a shutdown phrase. It is what people say when logic collapses. If something looks immoral by every human standard, calling it mysterious does not make it moral. It just makes it unquestioned. Look at the story of Job. God allows Satan to destroy Job's life to win a bet. Job loses his children, his health, and his livelihood. At the end, God gives him new children as if replacements erase the loss. This story teaches that human suffering is acceptable collateral for divine ego. No loving parent would treat their children as expendable props in a cosmic argument. And when Job finally asks why this happened, God does not explain. He intimidates. He brags about his power. He tells Job he is too small to question him. This is not wisdom. This is authoritarianism. It teaches obedience, not understanding. Then there is thought crime. Jesus says that looking at a woman with lust is the same as committing adultery. He says anger is the same as murder. This collapses moral categories. Thoughts are not actions. If they were, prisons would be full of people who never harmed anyone. By criminalizing thoughts, Christianity creates constant guilt and shame. It turns normal human psychology into sin. This constant guilt is not accidental. It keeps believers dependent. If you are always broken, you always need saving. If you are always sinful, you always need forgiveness, and forgiveness is controlled by the belief system itself. Another uncomfortable truth is how the Bible treats non-believers. In 2 Corinthians, believers are told not to associate closely with unbelievers. They are called darkness. In the Old Testament, entire tribes are slaughtered for worshiping other gods. This us versus them mentality fuels division. It teaches people to see outsiders as morally inferior or dangerous. We see the real-world effects of this thinking everywhere. Families split when one member leaves the faith. Friends are treated as projects to be converted rather than equals to be respected. Love becomes conditional. And let us talk about prophecy. Christians claim the Bible predicts the future, but many so-called prophecies are vague, rewritten after the fact, or taken out of context. Jesus himself predicts the end of the world within the lifetime of his listeners. He says some standing there will not taste death before the kingdom comes. They all died. The world continued. Christians then redefine what he meant. Spiritual kingdom. Invisible fulfillment. But when predictions fail, reinterpretation replaces honesty. Failed prophecy is not evidence of mystery. It is evidence of error. The resurrection itself relies entirely on anonymous sources written decades later. The Gospels contradict each other on who found the tomb, when they arrived, who was there, and what happened next. In any court of law, these accounts would be considered unreliable. But faith demands a lower standard of evidence than we use for everyday decisions. Another ignored verse is in Ephesians, where slaves are told to obey their masters as they would obey Christ. This is in the New Testament. After Jesus. After love and grace. Slavery is not condemned. It is reinforced. This verse was used by Christian slave owners for centuries. The Bible was not the force that ended slavery. Secular moral progress was. The same applies to LGBTQ people. Leviticus calls gay relationships an abomination. Romans describes them as unnatural and deserving death. Christians today often say they love gay people but hate the sin. But the text does not separate identity from behavior. The harm caused by these verses is real. Depression, suicide, rejection. All justified by ancient texts written by people who knew nothing about modern psychology or human sexuality. If God is timeless and all-knowing, why does his moral guidance align perfectly with the prejudices of ancient cultures? And finally, there is the issue of evidence. Christianity asks people to believe extraordinary claims with ordinary stories. No physical evidence, no independent records, no repeatable demonstrations, just faith. But faith is not a virtue. Faith is believing without sufficient evidence, and every religion uses faith to justify itself. If faith can lead people to completely opposite conclusions, then faith is not a reliable path to truth. These verses are not attacks from atheists. They are part of the Bible itself. The discomfort comes not from criticism, but from reading honestly. And once you read honestly, it becomes clear. This book reflects human beliefs, human fears, and human power structures, not divine perfection. Another verse that quietly disappears from most sermons is in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, "Anyone who relaxes even the least of the commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven." This becomes a problem because modern Christians ignore most biblical commandments daily. Dietary laws, clothing rules, Sabbath laws, purity laws, all abandoned. So either Christians are knowingly disobeying Jesus, or they have redefined his words to fit modern comfort. Either way, authority is no longer coming from Scripture, but from personal preference. Then there is the idea of blood sacrifice. Christianity teaches that without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. This idea comes from Hebrews. Think about how strange that is when you remove religious conditioning. An all-powerful being cannot forgive unless someone is tortured and killed. That is not justice. That is ritual violence. Humans have moved away from blood rituals because we recognize them as primitive. Yet Christianity centers its entire moral framework on one. Imagine explaining this to someone with no exposure to religion, that a God needed to sacrifice his son to himself to forgive humans for rules he created. It sounds less like divine wisdom and more like mythological storytelling trying to solve a problem it invented. Another ignored issue is how Jesus treats outsiders. In Matthew chapter 15, a Canaanite woman begs Jesus to heal her daughter. Jesus initially refuses and compares her to a dog. He says he came only for Israel. Only after she humbles herself does he help her. Christians often call this a test of faith. But if this were any other figure, we would call it ethnic exclusion. The idea that compassion must be earned through humiliation should trouble anyone who values human dignity. Then there is the issue of contradictions. Christians are often told the Bible is perfectly consistent, but the text itself disagrees. One gospel says Judas hanged himself. Another says he fell and burst open. One says Jesus' last words were peaceful. Another says he cried out in despair. These are not small differences. They change the meaning of the story. And instead of acknowledging human error, believers twist themselves into knots trying to force harmony where none exists. And what about salvation requirements? In some verses, salvation comes through belief alone. In others, through works. James says faith without works is dead. Paul says works do not matter. So which is it? The answer depends on which verse you like more. That is not divine clarity. That is human disagreement preserved in text. Another deeply uncomfortable verse is in Luke chapter 19, where Jesus tells a parable that ends with enemies being brought before him and slaughtered. Christians say it is symbolic, but symbolic of what? A peaceful kingdom or violent judgment? You cannot separate Jesus from violence entirely when the text itself does not. Then there is the obsession with obedience. Over and over, the Bible praises submission. Submit to God. Submit to authority. Submit to masters. Submit even when authority is unjust. Romans chapter 13 tells believers to obey governing authorities because they are established by God. This verse has been used to justify dictatorships, apartheid, and oppression. If every authority is God-approved, resistance becomes sin. History shows where this thinking leads. Churches blessing wars. Pastors defending slavery. Religious leaders siding with power instead of victims. This is not accidental misuse. It is built into the theology. Another ignored reality is how often God changes his mind. In Genesis, God regrets creating humans and floods the earth. Later, he promises never to do it again. In Exodus, Moses convinces God not to destroy Israel. This shows a God who reacts, regrets, and negotiates, not an all-knowing being with a perfect plan. Believers call this relational, but it looks exactly like how ancient people imagined gods behaving. And consider the flood itself. Killing nearly every living thing, including children and animals, is described as justice. But animals had no moral agency. Babies had no chance to choose right or wrong. This is mass killing on a scale we would call evil if any human did it. Yet because God does it, it is rebranded as righteousness. Then there is the obsession with purity. Women are considered unclean during menstruation. After childbirth, a woman must be purified longer if she gives birth to a girl than a boy. This is not symbolism. It is biological ignorance mixed with patriarchy. Yet it is presented as divine instruction. Another ignored verse appears in John chapter 14, where Jesus says no one comes to the Father except through him. This single sentence has justified centuries of religious exclusion. Billions of people born into other cultures are automatically condemned, not for actions, not for harm, but for geography and upbringing. That is not justice. Let us also talk about miracles. Jesus says faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. Mountains remain unmoved. Believers then say it means spiritual obstacles. But again, this is reinterpretation after failure. When claims do not match reality, meanings are quietly adjusted. Another uncomfortable truth is that the Bible normalizes violence against children. Proverbs says spare the rod and spoil the child. Physical punishment is endorsed. This thinking has justified abuse for generations. Modern psychology tells us hitting children causes harm. Once again, human knowledge corrected Scripture. And what about the obsession with end times? Jesus and Paul both believed the end was imminent. Paul advised people not to marry because the time was short. They were wrong. The world did not end. Christianity had to adapt because reality forced it to. This pattern repeats constantly. Scripture makes a claim. Reality contradicts it. Belief adjusts instead of admitting error. At some point, the question becomes unavoidable. Why defend a book that needs constant reinterpretation to survive modern knowledge? If morality improves over time, and Scripture stays the same, then morality is not coming from Scripture. If empathy leads us to reject biblical commands, then empathy is doing the moral work. And if honesty requires ignoring parts of the Bible to preserve faith, then faith is no longer about truth. These verses are uncomfortable because they expose the human origin of the text. Human fear, human control, human power, human limitation. And once you allow yourself to see that, the spell breaks.